The karst mountains had a way of making people feel small. Not in the poetic sense that travel magazines like to print beneath glossy photographs, not the humble, awe-inspired smallness that came from standing beneath an ancient cliff face or watching a sunset paint itself across a vast horizon. No, the karst mountains made people feel small in a far more honest, far more uncomfortable way. They made people feel like they were not supposed to be there. Like the mountains themselves were tolerating their presence the way a sleeping animal tolerates a fly, aware of it, annoyed by it, but not yet motivated enough to swat it away. Marcus Chen had climbed through these mountains for 3 days, and he had not once forgotten that feeling. Terrain was brutal. Limestone karsts rose from the earth like broken teeth, their surfaces weathered into impossible shapes by 100 million years of rain and wind and patient, indifferent geology. The paths, if you could generously call them that, were narrow ridgelines barely wide enough for one person, dropping away on either side into mist-filled valleys where the trees grew so thick and so tall that their canopies swallowed the sky whole. Every step required attention. Every handhold had to be tested. The rock here was treacherous, smooth in places, crumbling in others, and always, always damp from the perpetual humidity that clung to the mountains like a second atmosphere. Marcus was 41 years old. He was not in bad shape. He ran 5 miles every morning before work, and his job kept him in the field often enough that his body remembered how to move through difficult terrain. But 3 days of continuous climbing with a 40-pound pack had ground him down to something raw and mechanical. His knees ached with a deep, bone-level throb. The balls of his feet were blistered beneath his boots despite the heavy-duty socks. His shoulders had gone past the point of soreness into a kind of numb acceptance, as though the straps of his pack had fused with his collarbones and become part of his skeleton. He stopped on a narrow ledge, planted his boot against a stable-looking outcrop and drank from his water bottle. The water was warm, it tasted like plastic and minerals. It was the best thing he had ever put in his mouth. Below him, the valley was a sea of green, impossibly deep, the trees so far beneath that they looked like moss. Above him, the karst continued upward, pale gray stone disappearing into low-hanging clouds that moved with the sluggish indifference of something that had nowhere in particular to be. The air smelled of wet rock, decaying vegetation, and something faintly mineral, copper, maybe, or iron. The mountains exhaled moisture with every breath of wind, and Marcus's clothes were perpetually damp, clinging to his skin in a way that made every movement feel like peeling off a second skin. He checked his GPS. The signal was weak. These mountains swallowed satellite signals the same way they swallowed sky, but the coordinates were close. Another hour, maybe less, and he'd reach the site. The site, that was what his paperwork called it. Site K7, a dragon nest documented by a conclave survey team 18 months ago, flagged for monitoring and then promptly forgotten about because dragons were dangerous, and the karst mountains were remote, and there were always easier problems to solve than trying to keep track of giant fire-breathing reptiles in one of the most inhospitable mountain ranges on the planet. But Marcus hadn't forgotten, he never forgot. He was a wildlife recovery specialist, which was a fancy title for a job that mostly involved picking up the pieces after other people's greed. Poachers, smugglers, black market dealers who sold dragon scales as luxury goods to wealthy collectors on off-world markets. Dragon eggs were even more valuable. A single viable egg could fetch prices that made Marcus's annual salary look like pocket change. The demand was insatiable. The supply was finite. And the creatures at the center of it all, the dragons, were dying. Marcus had spent 11 years studying them. He had read every paper, every field report, every conclave-published monograph on dragon biology, behavior, and ecology. He had memorized the taxonomic classifications, the subspecies variations, the known nesting ranges and migration patterns. He could identify a dragon's age, health, and probable territorial range from a single scale. He could distinguish between the 6 known fire types: standard combustion, plasma vent, chemical burn, cold fire inversion, sonic ignition, and the rare electromagnetic discharge variant found only in the deep-sea leviathan subspecies. He had degrees in xenobiology and non-sapient ecology. He had published 7 peer-reviewed papers. He had been invited to speak at 3 international conferences. None of it had prepared him for what he found when he finally pulled himself over the last ridge and looked down into the nest. The cave was set into the face of a karst formation so massive that Marcus had to tilt his head back to see its top. The entrance was a dark gash in the limestone, roughly 15 feet wide and 10 feet tall, partially obscured by a curtain of hanging vines and moss that made it look less like a cave mouth and more like a wound in the mountain. Water trickled down either side of the opening, thin streams that caught the gray afternoon light and glittered like liquid silver. Marcus approached slowly. He unslung his pack, pulled out his headlamp, and clicked it on. The beam cut through the shadows beyond the vine curtain, revealing a passage that sloped gently downward, the floor smooth and worn not by water, but by something large and heavy that had passed through here many, many times. Dragons, definitely dragons, He pushed through the vines and went inside. The smell hit him first. It was complex, not the simple sulfurandrot that most people associated with dragon lairs, but a layered, almost organic scent. Warmth somehow, like sun-heated stone, like the air above a fire after it's been burning for hours. Beneath that, something animal, musk, skin, the faintly acidic tang of reptilian biology. And beneath that, something else, something wrong. Marcus stopped walking. His headlamp beam swept the cave walls. They were covered in scratch marks, deep parallel grooves where claws had raked across the limestone. Some were old, faded to the color of the surrounding rock. Others were fresh, the gouged stones still pale and raw. The marks told a story. A large dragon, adult, probably female based on the nest site, had lived here for a long time. She had maintained the cave, marked it, defended it. The scratches were messages, territorial declarations, the dragon equivalent of a no trespassing sign written in stone. But there were other marks too, newer ones, different ones. Marcus crouched and examined a set of scratches near the floor. They were shallower than the dragon marks, more deliberate, and they were made by something with 5 narrow points rather than broad claws. A hand, human hands. Someone had been here recently, and they had been using tools. Marcus could see the faint outline of a chisel mark where someone had tried to pry a scale fragment from the wall. "Damn it," he whispered. He moved deeper into the cave. The passage widened into a chamber roughly 30 feet across, with a ceiling that vaulted upward into darkness beyond his headlamp's reach. The floor was covered in a fine layer of dust and dragon scale fragments, small, translucent pieces that caught his light and scattered it into tiny rainbows. The remnants of a nest occupied the center of the chamber, a broad, shallow depression lined with crushed stone, dried vegetation, and layers of compacted dragon scale that had been shed over what must have been years. The nest was enormous, easily 15 feet in diameter, and it bore the unmistakable signs of long-term use. It also bore the unmistakable signs of destruction. Marcus stood at the edge of the nest and looked down. His headlamp illuminated the scene with merciless clarity, and he felt something cold settle into his stomach, a feeling he recognized as the particular grief of someone who has arrived too late. 6 eggs, there had been 6 eggs. He knew this because there were 6 distinct hollows in the nest, each one perfectly shaped, each one precisely spaced in the pattern that conclave literature described as standard for the obsidian mountain subspecies. Each hollow was lined with a careful arrangement of warm stone and soft vegetation, each one a small, perfect cradle engineered by a mother dragon over weeks of patient labor. Every single one of them was empty, destroyed. The shells had been smashed, not hatched, smashed. Marcus could see the difference with agonizing clarity. Hatched eggs broke along natural fracture lines, the pieces separating cleanly where the hatchling pushed its way out. These shells had been shattered by external force. Fragments were scattered across the nest, some large, some reduced to powder, all of them bearing the same obsidian black color with veins of deep amber running through them like molten copper frozen in time. The poachers had cracked them open like piñatas, looking for the embryos inside. Dragon embryos were worth even more than eggs on the black market, prized by certain off-world collectors who wanted to display them in preservation jars as curiosities. Marcus knelt in the nest. His knees sank into the crushed stone and dried vegetation, and he could feel the residual warmth in the material. The nest had been warm, recently warm, maintained by the mother dragon's body heat. She had been here. She had been incubating her eggs, doing what mother dragons had done for millions of years across 100 worlds. And she had left to hunt, to drink, to patrol her territory. And while she was gone, someone had come in and destroyed everything she had built. He picked up a shell fragment. It was lighter than he expected, thin and almost ceramic in texture with a faint inner sheen where the membrane had attached. The amber veins glowed faintly under his headlamp, catching the light and holding it. Beautiful. Even destroyed, even reduced to a broken piece of something that would never hatch, it was beautiful. He set the fragment down carefully and swept his headlamp across the chamber in a slow arc, looking for more evidence. Boot prints in the dust, at least 2 sets, one large and one small. Tool marks on the nest wall where someone had levered out a section of the scale lining. A length of rope abandoned on the cave floor, the kind used by climbers and poachers for hauling heavy loads. And near the back of the chamber, a pile of organic matter that Marcus identified, after a moment of confused squinting, as the remains of the nest's vegetation lining that had been ripped out and discarded. Thorough, the poachers had been thorough. They had taken everything, every egg, every fragment of value, every piece of the nest that might be saleable. They had left nothing behind except wreckage. Marcus sat back on his heels and pressed his palms against his eyes. He breathed slowly, deliberately, counting each exhale the way his therapist had taught him during the bad months after his divorce. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The anger was there, a hot, sharp thing that wanted to come out as shouting or punching or something equally pointless, but he pushed it down. Anger was a luxury. Right now, he needed to be precise. He pulled out his phone, no signal, of course. He took photographs anyway, methodical, overlapping shots of the nest, the shell fragments, the boot prints, the tool marks. He measured the nest dimensions and recorded them in his field notebook. He collected shell fragments into evidence bags, labeling each one with a date, time, and location reference. He did all of this with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has performed the same grim ritual many times before because he had. 6 times before, to be exact. 6 nests, 6 destructions, 6 sets of photographs and evidence bags and reports that nobody important would ever read. He was finishing his documentation when his headlamp caught something. It was in the deepest part of the chamber, tucked beneath a shelf of limestone that jutted out from the cave wall about 2 feet above the floor. The shelf created a natural alcove, a small sheltered space that was partially hidden from the main chamber by a protrusion of rock. Marcus had to get on his hands and knees and crawl beneath the shelf to see it properly, and when he did, his breath stopped. One egg. One egg still intact. It was smaller than the others, or at least it looked smaller. Marcus's perspective was distorted by the cramped space and the angle, but when he carefully measured it with his hands, he found it was roughly the same size as the hollows in the nest, which meant it was a normal-sized egg. It had simply been hidden, pushed beneath the shelf, perhaps by the mother dragon as a precaution, a last-ditch effort to protect at least one of her children. Or perhaps it had rolled here during the destruction, knocked loose from its hollow by the poacher's frantic work and tumbling into the only concealed space in the chamber. Marcus would never know which. He pulled it out gently, cradling it in both hands. It was warm. Not room temperature warm, not residual heat from the nest warm, warm, alive warm. He pressed his thumbs against the shell and held them there, and after a moment, 5 seconds, 10, 15, he felt it. A pulse. Faint, slow, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something deep in a dream. The embryo inside was alive. Marcus sat on the cave floor with the egg in his hands and stared at it. His headlamp cast harsh shadows across the obsidian surface, and the amber veins seemed to shift and move in the light as though the egg itself was breathing, which, in a sense, it was. The shell was porous. Dragon eggs exchanged gases through microchannels in the shell matrix, a feature that Marcus had written an entire paper about, and the faint warmth he felt was the embryo's metabolic output, visible and tangible evidence of a life that was hanging by the thinnest possible thread. He knew what he should do. The protocol was clear, printed on laminated cards that every wildlife recovery specialist carried in their field kits. In the event of discovering a viable dragon egg at a compromised nest site, document the location, secure the egg in a temperature-controlled transport container, contact the nearest conclave biological oversight office, and await retrieval. Do not attempt to incubate. Do not attempt to transport independently. Do not attempt any intervention beyond basic stabilization. He didn't have a temperature-controlled transport container. He didn't have a conclave contact who would arrive in time. The nearest office was in the city, 6 hours away by vehicle, longer by the routes available from this location. And the ambient temperature in the cave, which he estimated at roughly 58 degrees Fahrenheit based on his wrist thermometer, was dropping. It was late afternoon. The sun was going down. The mountains lost heat fast once the light faded, and caves, even shallow ones, followed the external temperature with only a few hours' delay. The egg needed warmth. Specifically, it needed the warmth that its mother would have provided, a constant, stable temperature of approximately 95 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained through direct body contact. Without that, the embryo's metabolism would slow. Its heart rate would drop. And at some point, Marcus didn't know exactly when because the available data on Obsidian Mountain Dragon incubation parameters was frustratingly incomplete. The slowdown would become irreversible. He looked at the egg. The egg looked back at him, in the sense that anything could look back at you when you were desperate enough to project meaning onto a piece of volcanic glass with a heartbeat inside it. Marcus Chen was not a rule breaker by nature. He was a careful, methodical man who followed procedures and filled out forms in triplicate and always parked within the lines. His ex-wife had called him the most predictable person on the planet during their last real conversation, and she hadn't meant it as a compliment. He filed his taxes early. He flossed every night. He had never once called in sick to work when he wasn't actually sick. But Marcus Chen had also stood in 6 destroyed nests and looked at 6 collections of broken shells. And he had written 6 reports that had been filed in 6 drawers that nobody ever opened. And he had gone home 6 times and sat in his empty apartment and thought about the creatures that would never hatch because the world was what it was, and people were what they were, and all the procedures and protocols and laminated cards in existence couldn't put a single broken egg back together. He unzipped his jacket. The egg fit against his chest perfectly, as though it had been designed for that space. Nestled in the hollow beneath his sternum, cradled by his ribs pressed against the steady thrum of his heart. He held it there with both hands and leaned back against the cave wall and tried to breathe normally, because he'd read somewhere, probably in one of Dr. Una Park's papers, She was always including these tantalizing asides about things that hadn't been formally studied, that embryos could sense vibration, and that a calm, steady heartbeat might serve as a soothing stimulus during the final stages of incubation. He didn't know if that was true. He didn't know if anything in his training applied to this situation, because his training assumed he would follow the protocol and call the conclave and let the experts handle it. And the experts had a 70% mortality rate for hatchlings under 6 months, and the numbers did the math for him whether he wanted them to or not. So he sat in the dark with an egg against his heart and waited. The cave was not silent. It was never completely silent. There was always water dripping from the ceiling in irregular rhythms, plinking into tiny pools on the cave floor with a sound that was almost musical. There were insects too, faint rustlings in the debris, and once a deeper sound from somewhere far back in the cave system that might have been water flowing through an underground channel or might have been something else entirely. Marcus chose to believe it was water. He thought about his ex-wife. He thought about the apartment they'd shared, the one with the good light in the kitchen where she used to make coffee on Sunday mornings and hum songs he didn't recognize. He thought about how she'd left not because of any single dramatic thing, but because of the slow accumulation of absences. The weekends he spent in the field, the evenings he spent writing reports, the conversations he half participated in while his mind was still in whatever nest or cave or forest he'd visited that day. She'd said, "You love those creatures more than you love me," and he'd said, "That's not true," and they'd both known he was lying, and she'd packed her bags the next morning while he was out on a 5-mile run. He thought about the mother dragon. She would come back. They always came back. She would return to her nest and find it destroyed, her eggs shattered, her children gone, and she would not understand why. Dragons were intelligent, not sapient, not in the way humans were, but intelligent in the way that wolves and elephants and crows were intelligent, capable of learning and remembering and forming social bonds. She would know that something terrible had happened. She might even know in some instinctive way that it had been done by the small, soft creatures who sometimes came into the mountains and took things. What she would do with that knowledge, Marcus didn't want to think about. The hours passed, the cave grew colder. Marcus shivered, and the shivering was bad because it meant his body was using energy to warm itself instead of warming the egg, so he pulled his jacket tighter and tucked his chin down and held on. His arms ached from maintaining the position. His back screamed against the cave wall. His legs went numb. He shifted as little as possible because every movement risked jostling the egg, and the egg was the only thing that mattered. At some point he slept. Not intentionally, he didn't realize he'd been asleep until he woke with a start. His neck cramped at an angle that sent a bolt of pain down his spine, and his first panic thought was, did I drop it? Did I drop the egg? Oh God, but his hands were still there, still pressed against the warm curve of the shell, still holding it safe against his chest. He checked the time, 1:23 a.m. He'd been unconscious for maybe 20 minutes. At 2:47 a.m., the egg cracked. The sound was small, a tiny tick, delicate and precise like a fingernail tapping on crystal. Marcus's eyes snapped open instantly, every nerve in his body jangling to full alertness, and for a disorienting moment he didn't know where he was or what was happening. Then he felt the vibration against his palms, a second tick, and his mind assembled the pieces with blazing clarity. He tilted his head down and watched. A thin line split the surface of the shell, a hairline fracture that ran from the top of the egg downward, following one of the amber veins like a road map. The line widened slightly, and a second fracture appeared at a right angle to the first, then a third, then a fourth, the shell breaking apart in a geometric pattern that was almost too precise to be random. Whatever was inside knew exactly what it was doing. Marcus's hands were shaking. He could feel the tremors running through his fingers, and he gripped the egg more firmly, then immediately relaxed his grip because what if he squeezed too hard? What if he crushed the shell and hurt it? The shell folded open. It didn't break. It folded, the pieces hinging outward along the fracture lines like the petals of a flower blooming in fast forward, each section rotating smoothly on some invisible pivot, revealing the creature inside in a sequence of overlapping dark panels that fell away like the wrapping of a gift. The hatchling was wet, slick with amniotic fluid that coated its entire body and made its scales gleam in the headlamp's beam like polished onyx. It was small, roughly the size of a kitten, Marcus estimated, though its proportions were different, longer in the body and shorter in the legs, with a tail that was already nearly as long as the rest of it. Its wings were tightly folded against its back, translucent membranes pressed flat against tiny skeletal struts that would one day support a wingspan measured in feet, but were currently the size of playing cards. Its scales were black, not dark gray, not charcoal black, a black so absolute and so deep that it seemed to exist in defiance of the light itself. The only color came from the amber veins that ran through the scales in branching patterns, matching the veins in the shell, pulsing faintly with a warmth that Marcus could feel even without touching them. The amber glowed. It actually glowed, a soft internal luminescence that pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves, synchronized with the hatchling's heartbeat. And its eyes were enormous. Disproportionately large, the way all baby animals' eyes are disproportionate, taking up nearly a third of the creature's skull. They were amber, the same amber as the veins, the same amber as the shell, and they were open, staring directly at Marcus with an expression that he could only describe as focused. Not confused, not scared, focused. As though the hatchling had emerged from the egg with a specific purpose in mind and had immediately identified the thing it was looking for. It opened its mouth. No fire came out, of course not. Hatchlings didn't produce fire for at least several weeks. The combustion organs needed time to develop the necessary bacterial colonies, just a sound. A high, warbling chirp like a bird crossed with a kettle whistle, bright and sharp and utterly without fear. Marcus held very still. His mind was running through the literature at breakneck speed. Dr. Unipark's 2031 paper on dragon cognitive development, Conrad Lawrence's foundational work on imprinting in greylag geese, the controversial Tessimer study from 2029 that suggested dragon hatchlings possessed an imprinting window of less than 6 hours, the shortest of any known species, during which they would form a permanent social bond with the first moving object they perceived as a caregiver. The conclave had dismissed Tessimer's findings, citing methodological flaws and an insufficient sample size. The conclave dismissed a lot of findings that didn't fit their existing frameworks. The hatchling chirped again. It shifted in the remnants of its shell, unsteady, its tiny legs trembling with the effort of supporting its own weight for the first time. It took one step, then another, each one a wobbly, uncertain negotiation with gravity that would have been comical under any other circumstances. It stepped out of the shell and onto Marcus's hand. Its feet were warm. The pads on the underside of its toes were soft and faintly tacky, providing grip, and they pressed against Marcus's palm with a gentle pressure that sent a shock through his nervous system. The hatchling balanced on his hand, swaying slightly, its tail whipping back and forth for counterbalance. Its enormous amber eyes never left his face. It chirped a third time, softer now, the warble dropping to a lower register, almost a coo. And then it did something that dismantled every carefully constructed intellectual framework Marcus had built over 11 years of study. It pressed its snout against his thumb. Not aggressively, not defensively, not as a prelude to biting or breathing fire or any of the behaviors that the conclave's literature described as standard hatchling responses to unfamiliar stimuli. It pressed its snout against his thumb the way a puppy presses its nose against its mother's belly, the way a child presses its face against a parent's hand, seeking contact, seeking warmth, seeking connection. And then it curled into a ball in his palm and went to sleep. Marcus sat in the dark cave with a sleeping dragon in his hand and felt something inside his chest crack open, not painfully, not like a break, but like a door that had been locked for a very long time finally swinging on its hinges. His eyes burned. His throat ached. He did not cry because he was 41 years old and he was a professional, and he was sitting in a cave in the karst mountains with an endangered species in his palm, and crying would not help either of them. But it was close. Well, he whispered, and his voice cracked on the single word like a boy's voice, not a man's. He cleared his throat and tried again. Well, I guess I'm a parent now. The hatchling slept on, undisturbed, its tiny body rising and falling with each breath, its amber glow pulsing soft and steady against the darkness of the cave. He named it Embers. Getting out of the mountains was harder than getting in. Marcus had to figure out how to carry a dragon hatchling while descending terrain that had nearly killed him on the way up, and the logistics of this turned out to be significantly more complicated than expected. Ember, the name had arrived fully formed, as though it had been waiting for the hatchling to exist, was too small to be carried loose, but too fragile to be stuffed into a pack. In the end, Marcus zipped his jacket to his chin and tucked the hatchling inside against his chest. And Ember, who had woken briefly during the rearrangement and chirped in what sounded like mild annoyance, promptly went back to sleep with his head tucked beneath Marcus's chin. The hike down was 6 hours of controlled misery. Marcus's knees protested every step with increasing volume. The blisters on his feet had burst and re-blistered, and each one throbbed in time with his heartbeat, which was inconvenient because Ember was pressed against that heartbeat and Marcus didn't want his pulse to be erratic. He stopped every 30 minutes to check on the hatchling, adjusting his jacket, making sure Ember hadn't shifted into a position that restricted his breathing, checking for signs of distress. There were none. Ember slept through the entire descent, warm and secure against Marcus's chest, waking only occasionally to chirp sleepily and press closer before drifting off again. Every time Marcus stopped to rest, Ember would chirp and press harder against him, as though checking that he was still real, still there, still the steady warmth and steady heartbeat that the hatchling had apparently decided was the center of the universe. Marcus would cup his hand around the tiny body and murmur nonsense. I'm here, buddy, I'm right here, I'm not going anywhere. And Ember would settle, satisfied, and sleep again. They reached the checkpoint at the base of the trail at 9:15 in the morning. Marcus had been awake for over 30 hours. His clothes were torn and filthy. He smelled like cave water, dragon amniotic fluid, and his own sweat. He probably looked like a man who had been through something, and he had, but he straightened his spine and lifted his chin and walked toward the checkpoint with the carefully constructed composure of someone who knew that the next few minutes would determine everything. The checkpoint was a simple affair. A concrete barrier across the trail, a small guardhouse, and a parking area with 2 government vehicles and a sleek alien-designed groundcraft that Marcus recognized as a Varethi transport. 2 human rangers stood by the barrier, looking bored. A Varethi inspector stood beside the transport, looking anything but. She was tall, nearly 7 feet, the lower end of average for her species, with the gray skin, elongated limbs, and wide-set eyes that marked her as Varethi. Her hair was pulled back in a tight arrangement of thin braids, and she wore the standard conclave biological oversight uniform, dark fabric with subtle geometric patterning that shifted color slightly in different light, designed to be both professional and vaguely intimidating. A tablet was strapped to her left wrist, and she was holding it with the particular two-handed grip that Varethi used when they wanted to look busy and authoritative simultaneously. Her name tag read Toril. Marcus knew the name. Toril was the senior conclave inspector for this region, and her reputation preceded her in the small community of human wildlife specialists who dealt with dragon-related matters. She was competent, thorough, and utterly convinced of the conclave's infallibility on all matters related to non-sapient species management. She had personally overseen the relocation of 3 dragon nests in the past 2 years. All 3 relocations had resulted in the deaths of the hatchlings within weeks. She had filed reports citing unavoidable complications and pre-existing health conditions and species-typical mortality factors. And the Conclave had accepted every word because the Conclave's relationship with inconvenient data was, in Marcus's experience, adversarial at best. Wildlife recovery, Marcus said, flashing his badge at the Rangers. Routine survey of Site K7. One of the Rangers nodded. The other squinted at his badge, seemed to decide it was legitimate, and waved him through. Toril did not wave him through. She stepped forward, blocking his path with a movement that was probably intended to look casual but landed somewhere between assertive and aggressive. Her eyes shifted color, a subtle continuous process that all Varethi underwent, their irises cycling through shades that reflected their emotional state, and in inspectors their scanning mode. Right now her eyes were a pale blue-green, which Marcus knew from his conclave orientation training indicated active thermal scanning. She was scanning him, of course she was. "You are carrying a live specimen," she said. Her voice was flat, accented in the way all Varethi speech was accented, too precise, each syllable carved out with surgical clarity, as though human language was a tool she found both useful and slightly distasteful. "No, I'm not," Marcus said. "I can see its thermal signature, human. Do not insult my senses." The word human was not a slur exactly. Varethi didn't use slurs, or at least, they didn't use them in settings where human witnesses could hear. But the way Toril said it, the slight emphasis, the downward inflection, the way it landed like a label rather than a descriptor, carried a weight that made Marcus's jaw tight. He weighed his options. Lying to a Varethi was futile. Their thermal imaging was sensitive enough to detect a mouse inside a coat at 20 paces, and Ember, while small, was a warm-blooded creature pressed directly against Marcus's core. The thermal signature would be unmistakable, a secondary heat source, smaller but distinct, moving in sync with Marcus's breathing. He unzipped his jacket just enough to reveal Ember's dark head peeking out. The hatchling's eyes opened immediately, blinking in the bright morning light, and it chirped once, a short, inquisitive sound, before pressing its snout against the exposed V of Marcus's jacket and looking up at Toril with an expression that could only be described as suspicious. Toril's eyes shifted through 3 colors in rapid succession. Blue-green to bright amber, surprise, to a deep, cold crimson, recognition, and then to something that Marcus had never seen in a Varetha's eyes before, a color that didn't appear in any of the training materials he'd studied. It was a dark, mottled gray, like storm clouds, and it made something in the back of his brain say danger with a conviction that surprised him. "A hatchling," Toril said, her voice had dropped half an octave, "from the karst nest. One survivor, the poachers got the rest. And you removed it from the site. It would have died. That is not your determination to make." The sentence hung in the air between them, and Marcus felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement, slow and massive, the kind of shift that rearranges landscapes. He had spent his entire career deferring to people like Toril, to the Conclave, to the experts with their degrees and their protocols and their absolute certainty that they knew better. He had written reports and filed forms, and accepted the conclave's conclusions even when the evidence in front of his own eyes contradicted them. Because that was what you did when you were a careful, methodical man who followed procedures and parked within the lines. He was done. No, he said. Toriel blinked. It was the first unguarded expression he'd seen on her face, a genuine startle, her wide-set eyes flickering back to that stormy gray. I beg your pardon. I said no, I'm a certified wildlife rehab specialist. I have the credentials to handle orphan megafauna. Check my file if you don't believe me. Conclave containment protocols for dragons are 40 years out of date. Your incubation parameters are based on data from the Varanthi subspecies, which is a completely different clade with different thermal requirements. Your facility design doesn't account for the obsidian mountain subspecies need for variable humidity during the first 72 hours post-hatching, which is why every single obsidian hatchling you've ever taken into custody has developed respiratory distress within the first week. He paused, his voice was steady, his hands were not shaking. Ember was a warm, solid weight against his chest, and somehow that warmth made the words come easier. Your facilities have a 70% mortality rate for hatchlings under 6 months. That's not a success rate. That's a massacre with paperwork. I'm not handing this creature over to die in a glass box so you can file another report about unavoidable complications. The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the wind moving through the trees above the checkpoint. He could hear the distant sound of a river. He could hear Ember purring against his chest, a low, rumbling vibration that the hatchling had apparently developed as a comfort mechanism, because it kicked in whenever Marcus's heart rate elevated, as though the tiny dragon was trying to soothe him. One of the rangers had stopped pretending not to listen. The other was very deliberately looking at the sky. Toriel's eyes settled on that dark, mottled gray and stayed there. You will regret this, human. Marcus looked at her. He looked at her name tag and her uniform and her tablet with its conclave encryption protocols, and her transport with its alien design and its alien technology and its alien assumptions about what humans were and were not capable of. He looked at all of it, and then he looked down at Ember, who had fallen back asleep with his head tucked under Marcus's chin, trusting completely, without reservation, without doubt. Because the hatchling had decided, in whatever mysterious, instinctive way dragons made such decisions, that this human was his, and that was enough. Marcus zipped his jacket back up, covering Ember completely, and walked past her. He didn't look back. 4 months. That was how long it took for a kitten-sized dragon to become something that could knock a grown man through a wall. 4 months of feeding and cleaning and sleeping in shifts, and learning the thousand small, exhausting, wonderful details of a creature that no human had ever successfully raised from hatchling to adulthood. 4 months of something that Marcus Chen had never expected to feel again, because he had been told by the conclave, by the literature, by every authority figure he had ever respected, that it was impossible. He had been told wrong. Ember grew like a fire fed by gasoline. In the first 2 weeks, he gained roughly a pound a day, his body converting food into mass with an efficiency that bordered on miraculous. Marcus fed him every 3 hours around the clock, a slurry of ground meat, crushed bone meal, and mineral supplements that Marcus prepared in a blender that would never be usable for human food again. The mixture smelled like death and looked worse, but Ember attacked every bowl with a ferocity that suggested he believed each meal might be his last. And Marcus, who understood something about the instincts of orphan creatures, never once tried to slow him down. By the end of the first month, Ember was the size of a large house cat. His scales had fully hardened from the soft, almost leathery texture of a newborn into the dense, overlapping plates that characterized the obsidian mountain subspecies. Each scale was a work of improbable engineering, black as midnight, thin at the edges and thick at the base, layered in a pattern that allowed them to flex and shift with the dragon's movement while maintaining an armor integrity that, according to conclave ballistic testing data, could stop a low-caliber round at close range. The amber veins that ran through each scale had deepened in color, shifting from the pale, translucent gold of the hatchling stage to a rich, burnished copper that seemed to glow from within, as though each scale contained a tiny flame that could never be extinguished. His eyes had changed too. They were still enormous, they would always be enormous, a proportionate holdover from his hatchling stage that would persist throughout his life, but the expression in them had evolved from the unfocused, instinctive stare of a newborn into something far more complex. Ember looked at things now. He studied them. He tracked moving objects with a precision that suggested sophisticated visual processing, and when he looked at Marcus, there was something in those amber depths that went beyond simple recognition. There was awareness. There was, and Marcus knew how unscientific this sounded even in the privacy of his own thoughts, affection. Not the conditional, transactional affection of a pet that had learned to associate its owner with food. Something deeper. Something that showed up in the way Ember would abandon a meal mid-bite if Marcus made a distressed sound, scrambling across the apartment with his stubby legs and stubbier wings to press himself against Marcus's ankle and chirp anxiously until reassured. Something that showed up in the way Ember positioned himself between Marcus and the apartment door every night, even though he was barely large enough to be a tripping hazard. His tiny body rigid with a protective vigilance that made Marcus's throat tighten every time he saw it. Something that showed up at 3:17 in the morning 3 weeks into their new life together when Marcus woke from a nightmare, the same nightmare he always had. The one where he arrived at a nest and found it destroyed and all the shells were empty and he was too late. Always too late, and found Ember awake beside him, staring at his face in the dark, the dragon's amber eyes glowing softly like two small lanterns. Ember chirped once very quietly, and then climbed onto Marcus's chest and lay down across his sternum, his full weight pressing down like a living, purring weighted blanket, and Marcus realized that the hatchling hadn't just woken up. Ember had woken up because of him, had sensed his distress through sound, through vibration, through some mechanism that Marcus couldn't identify and the Conclave had never documented, and had responded with the only tool available to him. Presence, warmth, the simple, devastating power of being there. Marcus put his hand on Ember's back and lay awake for a long time after that, staring at the ceiling of his apartment, feeling the dragon's heartbeat against his own, faster than his, but steady, so steady, and thinking about all the Conclave reports he had read that described dragons as solitary, non-social, and incapable of forming interspecies attachment bonds. Reports written by people who had never held one against their chest at 3:17 in the morning. The apartment was a problem. It had been a problem from the beginning, honestly, a cramped two-bedroom unit in the city's old district, with thin walls, inadequate ventilation, and a landlord who had already sent 3 increasingly passive-aggressive notices about the unusual pet odor emanating from Unit 4B. But in the first weeks, when Ember was small and relatively contained, the apartment had been manageable. A modified heating pad served as a nest. A baby gate kept Ember in the kitchen area during the day. Marcus covered the windows with blackout curtains to prevent the dragon's bioluminescent glow from being visible from the street. None of these measures worked anymore. Ember was the size of a golden retriever now, and he had the personality of a deeply territorial Rottweiler crossed with a nuclear weapon. The baby gate had lasted approximately 48 hours before Ember figured out how to unhook it with his claws, and after that, the concept of containment became purely theoretical. The heating pad had been replaced by a custom-built nest platform that Marcus constructed from fireproof insulation panels and thermal regulating fabric, which Ember accepted with the grudging tolerance of a teenager whose parents had redecorated his room without consultation. The blackout curtains were still in place, but Ember had discovered that he could hook them with his wing claws and pull them aside when he wanted to look outside, which was often, because Ember was fascinated by the city, the lights, the sounds, the constant movement of people and vehicles that he watched with his head tilted and his amber eyes wide and his tail twitching back and forth like a cat tracking a laser pointer. The scorch marks were the worst part. Dragon fire development was a gradual process. The combustion organs, a pair of specialized glands in the throat that housed colonies of thermophilic bacteria capable of producing extreme exothermic reactions, matured slowly over the first 6 months of life. Hatchlings produced no fire at all. Juveniles produced small, uncontrolled puffs and sparks, the biological equivalent of a child learning to whistle, enthusiastic but directionless. It wasn't until the 4-month mark that a juvenile dragon began to develop deliberate fire control. And even then, the output was unpredictable, prone to surges and misfires triggered by strong emotions. Ember's emotions were strong, all of them, all the time. He was joyful when Marcus came home, explosively joyful, wing-flaring, smoke-puffing, tail-wagging joyful. The kind of joy that could not be contained in a small body and therefore expressed itself in thermal events. The wall behind the front door now bore a scorch pattern that Marcus had tried to cover with a poster, then a tapestry, then a piece of furniture, and had finally given up and simply accepted as a feature of the interior design. The kitchen counter had a melted corner where Ember had gotten excited about breakfast. The bathroom door had a scorch streak across its surface at exactly Ember's head height, the result of an incident involving a bath that Marcus did not care to describe in detail. And then there was the cold fire. That had been the real surprise. The Obsidian Mountain subspecies was one of only 2 known dragon variants capable of producing inverted fire, a defensive mechanism where the throat bacteria operated in reverse, absorbing ambient thermal energy rather than releasing it, producing a blast of extreme cold that could flash freeze organic tissue in seconds. The conclave's literature mentioned cold fire in passing, noted it as theoretically significant but rarely observed in captivity, and moved on, because the conclave had never successfully kept an obsidian mountain dragon alive long enough to observe anything. Ember's cold fire had manifested at roughly 3.5 months, and it had manifested not as a gradual development but as a full-throated, room-chilling event at 2:00 in the morning that Marcus initially mistook for a heating system failure. He had woken to find frost creeping across the walls, his breath clouding in front of his face, and Ember standing in the middle of the living room with his jaws open and a pale blue glow pulsing in the back of his throat. The dragon's eyes were wide, not with aggression, but with what Marcus could only interpret as surprise, as though Ember himself hadn't known he could do this and was as startled by the result as Marcus was. The cold fire had dissipated after about 10 seconds, leaving behind a coating of ice on every surface within a 15-foot radius, including Marcus's water glass, his toothbrush, and devastatingly his laptop. Ember had chirped once, a small, apologetic sound, and then slunk over to Marcus and pressed his cold snout against Marcus's hand in a gesture that was so obviously contrite that Marcus had to laugh despite the laptop situation. The laptop was a loss. The data was backed up. Everything Ember did that destroyed something was followed by a moment of such genuine, heartfelt remorse that Marcus found it impossible to stay angry, even when the destruction was extensive. Dragons, he was learning, did not destroy things out of malice or even carelessness. They destroyed things because they were young and powerful and living in a world that was not built to withstand them. And every accidental scorch mark and every frozen water glass was a reminder that Ember did not belong in a cramped apartment in the old district. He belonged in the mountains, in the wild, in the world he had been born into. But the world he had been born into had killed his siblings and stolen his nest, and the creature he had imprinted on was a 41-year-old human with a destroyed laptop and a growing suspicion that he was in over his head. The first incident happened on a Tuesday. Marcus had established a routine for their outdoor time. Every morning at dawn, before the streets filled with people and cars and the 1,000 potential triggers that could send a growing dragon into protective overdrive, he would take Ember for a walk through the old cemetery 2 blocks from the apartment. It was a strange place for a daily constitutional, a sprawling Victorian graveyard with crumbling headstones, overgrown paths, and a population of feral cats that Ember regarded with intense predatory interest. But it had 3 critical advantages. It was fenced, it was empty at dawn, and the thick tree cover obscured the view from surrounding buildings. These walks were the highlight of Ember's day. Marcus could see it in every line of the dragon's body, the way his tail rose high as soon as they stepped outside, the way his wings half unfolded in a posture that Marcus had come to recognize as the dragon equivalent of a smile, the way his snout twitched with each new scent, processing the olfactory landscape with an intensity that made Marcus's limited human nose feel like a handicapped afterthought. Ember investigated everything: fire hydrants, mailboxes, discarded bottles, a particularly interesting crack in the sidewalk that the dragon spent 4 full minutes staring at before deeming it unworthy of further attention, a squirrel that had the misfortune of crossing their path and immediately regretted every decision that had led it to this moment, fleeing up a tree with a velocity that suggested it had briefly achieved enlightenment. Marcus watched Ember explore with a feeling he couldn't name, or rather, a feeling he could name but didn't want to, because naming it would make it real, and making it real would mean admitting that the careful, methodical, procedure-following version of himself had been replaced by something softer and more dangerous. He felt pride. Not professional pride, not the quiet satisfaction of a well-written report or a correctly identified specimen, but something rawer and more personal. He was proud of this creature, proud of the way Ember moved through the world with confidence and curiosity, proud of the way the dragon's scales caught the early morning light and scattered it into copper and black rainbows, proud, in a way that made no logical sense, of the simple fact that Ember existed. They were passing through the older section of the cemetery, the part with the weathered obelisks and the headstones so old their inscriptions had worn to smooth indentations, when Ember stopped. Not gradually, not with the slow, circling hesitation of a creature that has noticed something interesting. Ember stopped instantly, all 4 feet planting into the ground, his body going rigid, his tail snapping straight behind him like a flagpole. His ears, small, pointed, set far back on his skull, rotated forward, and his nostrils flared. Marcus felt the change in the air. It was subtle, a shift in pressure, a tightening, the way the atmosphere feels before a storm, and he knew from 3 months of living with this creature that it meant Ember had detected something that Marcus's limited human senses couldn't perceive. "What is it?" he murmured. Ember didn't chirp, he didn't move. His amber eyes were fixed on a point ahead of them, a large mausoleum with a corroded bronze door, its stone facade crumbling, its steps overgrown with ivy. The space between the mausoleum and the next tomb was a dark gap, maybe 4 feet wide, invisible from any angle except the one they were currently approaching. A man stepped out of the gap. He was tall, taller than Marcus, who was 6 feet and lean, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, his face in shadow. He moved fast, covering the distance between the mausoleum and the path in 3 long strides, and there was something in his hands, something metallic, catching the thin dawn light, and Marcus's brain was still processing the visual information when Ember moved. The dragon didn't roar, he didn't hiss. He didn't make any of the dramatic cinematic sounds that people expected from dragons. He made a sound that Marcus had never heard before, a low, resonant hum that seemed to originate not from Ember's throat but from somewhere deeper, somewhere in the dragon's chest, as though the sound was being produced by his bones themselves. It was a vibration more than a noise, a frequency that Marcus felt in his teeth and his sternum and the base of his skull, and it carried with it a weight of intent that was unmistakable. Stop! Ember put himself between Marcus and the approaching figure, not behind Marcus, between. The dragon planted his body in the path like a living barricade, his stance wide, his head low, his amber eyes fixed on the man with an intensity that made the air between them feel like a physical barrier. His wings flared open, not fully, not the dramatic full spread that dragons used for intimidation displays, but a partial flare just enough to widen his silhouette to make himself appear larger than he actually was. A calculated response, not panic, not blind aggression. Assessment and positioning, executed with a speed and precision that spoke to instincts honed by millions of years of evolution. The flames came. Not fire, not yet. But Marcus saw them flickering to life in the depths of Ember's amber eyes, tiny tongues of actual flame dancing in the irises like candles lit inside lanterns. It was a visual display, a warning signal, and it was beautiful in a way that was terrifying because Marcus understood with a clarity that cut through the adrenaline like a blade that this was Ember saying in the only language available to him, "I will burn you if you touch him." The man stopped. His hands came up slowly, and Marcus saw that the metallic object was a folding knife, not large but sharp, the kind of thing carried by someone who expected to need it. The man's face was young, mid-20s maybe, and beneath the hood his expression was a map of conflicting impulses, aggression, surprise, and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "I just want my wallet back," the man said. His voice cracked on the last word. "Someone took it, I thought you were." "Walk away," Marcus said. His voice came out quiet, steady, the kind of quiet that is louder than shouting because it carries the weight of someone who is not afraid even when they should be. Now. The man looked at Ember. Ember looked at the man. The flames in the dragon's eyes burned brighter and the hum deepened, and a thin wisp of smoke curled from between Ember's slightly parted jaws, not fire, just smoke, just heat escaping, but the visual was unmistakable. A dragon, smoking, staring at you with fire in its eyes. The man walked away, very quickly. His knife disappeared into his pocket, and he moved with the particular speed of someone who has just realized that the situation they thought they controlled has been fundamentally reconfigured by variables they hadn't accounted for. He didn't look back. He melted into the pre-dawn shadows between the tombstones and was gone. Ember held his position for another 30 seconds. His eyes tracked the retreating figure, and the hum continued low and constant, a standing wave of threat that filled the cemetery like an invisible force field. Only when the man's footsteps had faded completely, not just to silence, but to the absence of silence, the kind of nothing that means something is truly gone, did Ember relax. The flames in his eyes dimmed. The hum faded. His wings folded back against his body. His tail, which had been rigid as a bar, softened into its usual gentle curve, and he turned to Marcus and chirped once low, questioning, with a rising inflection at the end that Marcus had come to recognize as Ember's way of asking, "Did I do good?" Marcus knelt down. His knees were shaking not from fear, not exactly, but from the adrenaline dump that always followed a sudden threat response. The body's way of saying that was dangerous and you are not as calm as you pretended to be. He put both hands on either side of Ember's head, cupping the dragon's skull the way he had done 100 times before, and he looked into those enormous amber eyes and saw, reflected in their depths, his own face. "You did good, buddy," he said softly, "but you can't set people on fire." Ember chirped again, clearly not understanding a single word, and then he rubbed his snout against Marcus's palm and purred. Marcus stayed kneeling in the cemetery for a long time after that, his hands on his dragon's head, his heart doing something complicated in his chest because he understood with the same cutting clarity that had accompanied the moment of the attack that what he had just witnessed was not a pet defending its owner. It was not a trained animal executing a conditioned response. It was not a reflex or a misfired instinct or a territorial display that had happened to coincide with a threat. It was a child protecting its parent. And the child was a dragon, and the parent was a human, and every authority in the known galaxy had said this was impossible. The second incident was worse. 3 days after the cemetery, Marcus came home from a supply run to find a Varethi transport parked in front of his building. Not the sleek groundcraft from the checkpoint, this was a larger vehicle, an armored personnel carrier with the Conclave's geometric insignia displayed on its flank in colors that were probably meant to look authoritative, but to Marcus's eye just looked aggressive. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, his shopping bag in one hand, and considered his options. He could keep walking. He could turn around, disappear into the city, and try to lose himself in the sprawl until the Conclave's attention shifted elsewhere. This was the rational option, the self-preserving option, the option that any sensible person would choose when faced with the combined weight of an interstellar bureaucracy that had decided you were a problem. But Ember was on the third floor. Ember was waiting for him. Ember had probably heard the transport arrive. The dragon's hearing was sensitive enough to pick up individual conversations from 2 blocks away, and was right now standing by the door, tail rigid, eyes blazing, waiting for Marcus to come home so he could press against him and chirp and know that everything was fine. Marcus walked into the building. The hallway smelled like Varethi. There was no other way to describe it, a faint, sharp, almost metallic scent that their species produced through specialized skin glands, a pheromonal marker that served as a territorial signal in their native environment and functioned in human spaces as an olfactory announcement that we are here and we are in charge. Marcus had encountered it before, in conclave offices and inspection sites, and it had always made the back of his neck prickle with an instinctive unease that he'd never been able to fully suppress. 4 Varethi officers stood outside his apartment door. They were in full tactical gear dark body armor with the same geometric patterning as Torel's uniform, scaled up and hardened for combat applications. Each one carried a containment lance, the Conclave's standard non-lethal response weapon for dangerous fauna, a 4-foot shaft of titanium alloy tipped with a glowing blue injector that delivered a sedative dose calibrated for creatures up to 2,000 pounds. The lances were designed to penetrate dragon scale. Marcus had seen the testing footage, the lances punching through armor plate like it was cardboard, the blue sedative flooding into the target's bloodstream, the massive creatures going down in seconds. He had also seen the footage of what happened when the sedative dose was miscalculated, which it often was, because the Conclave's dosage charts were based on Varanthi subspecies data and did not account for the metabolic differences of the Obsidian Mountain variant. He had seen the seizures. He had seen the respiratory failure. He had seen the dragons die on concrete floors while Conclave technicians looked at their tablets and said things like anomalous response and dose adjustment required. 3 of the officers were positioned in a semicircle around the door. The 4th, the largest, standing a full head taller than the others, was directly in front of the apartment, his containment lance held across his body in a ready stance. They all had the same expression, professional, focused, and utterly devoid of the kind of nuance that might lead someone to hesitate before breaking down a door and sedating a living creature. Torel was there too. She stood in the hallway with her arms crossed and her eyes that particular shade of gray that Marcus had learned meant she was furious. Beside her, 2 human police liaisons in their neat blue uniforms stood with the body language of people who wanted to be literally anywhere else, shoulders hunched, hands clasped in front of them, eyes fixed on the floor with the desperate intensity of people trying to make themselves invisible through sheer force of will. Marcus Chen, Torel said. She did not shout. She didn't need to. Her voice carried the cold, measured authority of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question, and it filled the narrow hallway like ice water. By order of the Conclave Biological Oversight Division, you are to surrender the dragon hatchling designated specimen K7 for immediate relocation to No, the Valdori Containment and Research Facility, where it will undergo behavioral assessment, and I said no. Marcus's voice was calm, quiet, the same quiet he'd used in the cemetery, the quiet that was louder than shouting. For the 3rd time, for the 4th time if we count the email I didn't send because your department doesn't deserve the courtesy. Torel's eyes darkened, the mottled gray deepened, the storm cloud color intensifying until her irises looked like thunderheads about to break. Your defiance is noted, we are not asking. The lead officer stepped forward. He moved with the fluid, economical grace that all Varethi seemed to possess, no wasted motion, no hesitation, every muscle fiber operating with the precision of a machine. His containment lance came up, the blue tip glowing brighter, and he fixed Marcus with a stare that was utterly without emotion. Last warning, human, step aside or be removed. Marcus didn't step aside. But he didn't need to. The window exploded inward. Not the door, the window. The 3rd floor window on the far side of the apartment, the one that Marcus had reinforced with fireproof plexiglass after Ember's cold fire incident, the one that looked out over the alley between his building and the next. Ember came through it like a black comet, trailing shards of reinforced glass and a roar of displaced air, and he did not land gently. He landed in a crouch between Marcus and the Varethi officers. All 90 pounds of him, muscle and scale, and 4 months of growth fueled by raw instinct and the kind of devotion that didn't care about the math, hit the apartment floor with a sound like a boulder dropping, and the impact cracked the hardwood beneath his claws. His wings snapped open to their full extent, nearly 6 feet from tip to tip, filling the hallway's sight lines with a wall of black and amber. His lips pulled back, revealing rows of teeth that were still small, still juvenile, but razor-sharp and numerous enough to make the lead officer take an involuntary step backward. What happened next lasted about 4 seconds. Marcus experienced those 4 seconds in a kind of slow motion, each moment etching itself into his memory with the permanence of a scar. The lead officer lunged with the containment lance. The blue tip came in low and fast, aimed at Ember's flank, a textbook targeting approach designed to penetrate the scale gap between the body and the rear leg where the armor was thinnest. It was a good shot, a professional shot. It should have worked. Ember sidestepped it. Not randomly, not through luck. The dragon shifted his body laterally with a fluidity that should have been biomechanically impossible for a creature his size and build, his weight transferring from his rear legs to his front in a motion that was more like a dance than a combat dodge. The lance passed beside him, the blue tip missing his scales by inches, and before the officer could recover, Ember's jaws closed on the shaft. Titanium alloy, 3/4 of an inch thick, designed to withstand the bite force of a fully grown dragon. Ember bent it. The sound was a long, groaning creak of stressed metal, the kind of sound that makes your teeth hurt because some deep, primitive part of your brain recognizes it as something that should not be happening. The shaft folded in the dragon's jaws like a piece of heated plastic, the titanium deforming under a bite force that Marcus's instruments had never measured, but which he now mentally recalibrated to significantly higher than the Conclave's estimates. The officer stumbled forward, pulled off balance by his own weapon, and Ember swept his tail low, a horizontal arc that caught the officer's ankles and sent him sprawling. The second officer fired a net launcher. Marcus saw the mechanism activate a compressed air discharge that sent a woven polyfiber net expanding outward in a 12-foot spread, weighted at the corners to entangle and immobilize. It was an effective tool. The Conclave had used it successfully on subadult dragons, according to the literature. Ember exploded upward. The word was precise. The dragon did not jump, he exploded, all 4 legs pushing off the floor simultaneously with a force that cratered the hardwood, his wings snapping open and beating once twice, driving him straight up toward the ceiling. The net passed beneath him, the weighted corners skittering across the floor with a sound like scattered coins, and Ember came down on the second officer's shoulders with the full focused weight of 90 pounds of armored predator. The officer went down hard. His knees buckled, his body folded, and Ember landed on top of him, pinning him to the floor with his front claws. The dragon's claws were pressed into the officer's armor, not through it, not quite, but deep enough to gouge visible grooves in the hardened material, and Marcus saw the officer's face through the helmet visor, and the expression on it was not fear. It was dawning comprehension. The expression of someone who had just realized, in the most visceral and personal way possible, that the intelligence briefing they'd been given before this operation had been wrong. The third and fourth officers retreated into the hallway. This was not a tactical withdrawal. It was a rout. They moved backward with the hurried, stumbling steps of people whose training had encountered a situation it had not prepared them for, their containment lances raised but their eyes fixed on Ember with an expression that Marcus recognized, because he had seen it on the face of the man in the cemetery. Fear. Ember turned toward them. His head swung around with that same liquid grace, his amber eyes locking onto the retreating officers, and his throat sac pulsed. The visible bulge beneath his jaw swelled, the skin stretching taut over the cold fire glands, and the air temperature in the hallway dropped. It didn't drop gradually. It plummeted. One moment Marcus could feel the normal warmth of the building's heating system. The next, his breath was coming out in thick white clouds, and frost was crawling across the walls, not the delicate, lacy frost of a winter morning, but a heavy, aggressive ice that spread from Ember's position outward like a shockwave, coating the wallpaper, the baseboards, the door frames, the conclave officer's armor. The temperature differential was extreme. Marcus estimated a drop of at least 40 degrees in less than 3 seconds, and he could see the officer's breath plumbing, could see the ice forming on the surface of their containment lances, could see one of them actually stumble and catch himself on the wall because the sudden cold had shocked his muscles into momentary unresponsiveness. Ember opened his mouth. The cold fire gathered at the back of his throat, visible as a pale blue glow that illuminated the inside of the dragon's jaws like a frozen sun. It was beautiful, it was horrible. It was the most terrifying thing Marcus had ever seen because he understood with perfect clarity what would happen if Ember released that fire. The officers would be flash frozen where they stood. Their armor would become coffins. Their blood would crystallize in their veins. And Ember would not understand what he had done, because Ember was protecting his parent, and the concept of proportionate response was not something that existed in the emotional vocabulary of a 4-month-old dragon. Zember. Marcus's voice cracked through the apartment like a whip. Not loud, he didn't need to be loud because Ember was listening for him, had been listening for him since the moment he'd come through the window, because Marcus's voice was the axis around which this creature's entire world revolved. The single word landed in the space between them with the weight of a physical force, and Ember froze. Not the rigid, aggressive freeze of a predator mid-attack, the freeze of a child caught in the act of doing something wrong. His head turned, those enormous amber eyes finding Marcus immediately, searching his face with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. The cold fire pulsed in his throat, bright, eager, ready to be released, and then slowly, like a wave pulling back from shore, it dimmed. Ember closed his mouth. The cold fire dissipated, the frost stopped spreading. The temperature in the hallway began to creep back toward normal, the ice on the walls starting to glisten as it entered the first stages of thaw. Ember's wings folded, his tail curled around his body. His head lowered and the flames in his eyes, the tiny, beautiful, terrifying flames went out, replaced by an amber that was soft and uncertain and very, very young. Marcus stepped forward, past the pinned officer who was breathing hard but uninjured, past the bent lance on the floor, still twisted into a shape that no piece of titanium alloy should ever hold, past the scattered net and the shattered window and the frost-covered walls and the two retreating officers who had pressed themselves against the far end of the hallway as though trying to merge with the plaster. He put his hand on Ember's snout. The dragon's scales were cold, colder than they should have been, the residual chill of the cold fire still bleeding through the armor plating, but beneath the cold Marcus could feel the warmth, the life, the steady, reliable heat of a creature that was, at this moment, looking up at him with an expression that contained multitudes, fear and trust and confusion and love and a desperate, aching need to know that he had done the right thing. No, Marcus said softly. His thumb traced the soft spot beneath Ember's jaw where the scales were thinnest, where the warmth was strongest, where the dragon's pulse beat against his skin like a small drum. We don't hurt people, understand. Ember's eyes flickered to the officers, back to Marcus, to the officers again. Calculating, processing. Marcus could almost see the gears turning behind those amber irises, the dragon's developing brain working through the contradiction. These people are a threat, I should eliminate the threat, but my parent says no, and my parent's word is the law that governs the universe. Then Ember lowered his head and pressed it against Marcus's palm. A low, rumbling sound came from deep in his chest, not a growl, not the threatening hum from the cemetery, but a purr. A long, slow, shuddering purr that vibrated through Marcus's hand and up his arm and into his chest, where it settled alongside his own heartbeat like a second rhythm, a counterpoint, a harmony. I understand, I trust you, I'm sorry, I love you. That was what the purr meant. Marcus knew it with a certainty that transcended language, transcended science, transcended every laminated protocol card he had ever carried. And in that moment, standing in his destroyed apartment with a dragon pressed against his palm and 4 conclave officers staring at him with expressions that ranged from shock to something uncomfortably close to awe, Marcus Chen understood something about dragons that no conclave report had ever contained. They didn't need to be managed, they needed to be loved. And when they were loved, truly loved, not studied or contained or leveraged for political advantage, they would move mountains for the person who loved them. Toril stood in the doorway, motionless. Her eyes had cycled through so many colors in the past 30 seconds that they'd essentially become a strobe light. Amber to crimson to blue to gray to a shade of pale gold that Marcus had never seen in a Varetha's eyes before, and which he suspected might be unique to her species' experience of profound cognitive dissonance. You controlled it, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. The authority was gone. The cold certainty was gone. What remained was something raw and unguarded, not fear, not exactly, but the Varethi equivalent of it, the sound of an assumption so fundamental that she had never thought to question it crumbling beneath her feet. That shouldn't be possible. The obsidian subspecies is classified as non-bondable. The Conclave has studied them for centuries. Maybe you should have studied harder, Marcus said. He didn't say it with triumph. He didn't say it with cruelty. He said it with the quiet, exhausted certainty of a man who had sat in a collapsed nest for 6 hours and warmed an egg with his own body heat and spent 4 months learning the language of a creature that the greatest scientific authority in the known galaxy had said could not be understood. One of the human police liaisons, the one on the left, a young woman with a sharp jawline and wide eyes, was holding her phone. The screen was on. The camera was active. It had been active, Marcus realized, for the entire confrontation. The red recording light blinked steadily, a small, patient witness to everything that had just happened. The video would leak within 48 hours. Of course it would. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, Marcus had a frightened dragon to comfort, a window to board up, and a future that had just become significantly more complicated than anything his procedure-following, line-parking, form-filing self could ever have prepared him for. He scratched Ember under the chin, and the dragon purred, and the frost on the walls melted, and somewhere in the vast, cold bureaucracy of the conclave, the first crack in a 400-year-old institution began to spread. The video leaked within 48 hours. Of course it did. Not through any deliberate action on Marcus's part. He hadn't spoken to a single journalist, hadn't posted a single thing on social media, hadn't so much as mentioned the incident to his mother during their weekly phone call, because his mother was 73 and had a heart condition, and learning that her son had been in the same room as a dragon cold fire event would have killed her faster than the cold fire itself. The leak came from the police liaison's phone because of course it did. The young woman with the sharp jawline and wide eyes had apparently sent the footage to a group chat, and group chats had a way of becoming public in the digital age. And within 6 hours of the incident, the video was everywhere. Everywhere. It ran on every news network on the planet. It was uploaded to every platform that would host it, copied and re-uploaded and mirrored across servers in jurisdictions that didn't care about conclave press embargoes or Earth government media requests. The headline wrote itself, variations of it appearing in a dozen languages simultaneously. Dragon protects human from conclave officers. The video the conclave doesn't want you to see. Man raises dragon and it chooses him over armed aliens. The footage was shaky and poorly lit, shot on a phone in portrait mode by someone whose hands were trembling, and none of that mattered. The content was undeniable. 43 seconds of video that showed in unambiguous terms a dragon, a juvenile obsidian mountain dragon, identifiable by its scale pattern and bioluminescent markings, disable 4 armed conclave officers in seconds and then stand down at a single spoken word from a human. Not a shock collar. Not a trained command sequence. Not a handler with years of professional experience and specialized equipment. A word, one word. A name spoken by a man who was standing in his bathrobe with dragon scale fragments in his hair and frost on his eyebrows, and the dragon, the creature that the conclave had spent 4 centuries insisting was non-bondable, solitary, and incapable of interspecies attachment, had heard that word and chosen to obey. The internet responded the way the internet always responded to things that challenged existing power structures, with overwhelming, chaotic, unstoppable enthusiasm. Memes proliferated. Fan art appeared within hours, stylized depictions of Ember in various heroic poses, some accurate, some wildly inaccurate, most of them endearing. A crowdfunding campaign to support Marcus's legal defense raised its initial goal in 11 minutes and had to be recalibrated upward 3 times in the first day. Someone started a petition to grant Ember legal personhood, which was legally absurd and emotionally irresistible, and gathered 2 million signatures in a week. A 12-year-old girl in Brazil posted a video of herself crying and saying, "He just loved him, that's all he did, he just loved him." And it became the most viewed video on the planet for 3 consecutive days. The conclave responded the way the conclave always responded to things it couldn't control, with a statement. It was a long statement, it was a carefully worded statement. It was a statement that had clearly been drafted by a committee of communications specialists and legal advisors and biological policy experts. And it said, in essence, that the video depicted an anomalous behavioral event that did not reflect the established scientific consensus on dragon-human interaction, and that the conclave stood by its evidence-based protocols, which had been developed over centuries of careful observation across multiple planetary ecosystems. It used the word anecdotal 3 times. It used the word unverified 5 times. It used the phrase insufficient sample size twice, which Marcus found darkly hilarious given that the conclave's sample size for successfully raising obsidian mountain dragon hatchlings was exactly 0. The statement did not address the bent containment lance. It did not address the frost on the walls. It did not address the fact that a 4-month-old juvenile dragon had demonstrated tactical combat awareness, thermal weapon deployment, and responsive behavioral modulation, all in the same 43-second window, which were 3 capabilities that the conclave's own developmental benchmark said shouldn't emerge for another 8 to 14 months. The statement did not address Marcus Chen at all, except obliquely, as an individual who is not authorized to possess or manage a Class A non-sapient species. Marcus read the statement at his kitchen table at 6 in the morning, 3 days after the incident, while Ember ate breakfast from a bowl on the floor beside him. The dragon had graduated from the meat slurry to solid food, raw chicken mostly, supplemented with whole eggs and the occasional fish, all of which Ember consumed with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been waiting his entire life for the invention of chicken. He ate with his whole body, his tail wagging, his wings half spread for balance, making small, contented grunting sounds between bites that were almost comically similar to the sounds Marcus's childhood dog had made while eating. Marcus set his phone down and looked at Ember. Ember looked up from his bowl, a piece of chicken dangling from his jaws, and chirped. An individual who is not authorized to possess or manage a Class A non-sapient species, Marcus said. Ember swallowed the chicken. He tilted his head. That's me, buddy. That's what they think I am. Ember chirped again, clearly unimpressed by the Conclave's taxonomic framework, and went back to his breakfast. The government's response was slower and more complicated than the internet's, because governments are always slower and more complicated than the internet, and because this particular government was caught between two forces that were pulling in opposite directions with equal and increasing ferocity. On one side, the Conclave. The Conclave was not a government. It presented itself as a scientific advisory body, a benevolent coalition of advanced species that offered guidance to less developed worlds, and it maintained this fiction with the kind of relentless PR sophistication that only a multiplanetary bureaucracy with a 4-century track record could manage. But everyone who dealt with the Conclave understood that advisory was a polite fiction. The Conclave had economic leverage. The Conclave had technological leverage. The Conclave had diplomatic leverage that extended across 100 worlds and several dozen allied species. And when the Conclave said jump, Earth's governments had spent the last decade saying how high with a consistency that would have been embarrassing if anyone had been willing to admit it. On the other side, the public. The public had seen the video. The public had seen a dragon choose a human. The public had seen 4 Conclave officers, representatives of an alien authority that had been telling humans what to do about dragons for a decade, get outmaneuvered by a creature that the Conclave insisted was no more capable of bonding than a lizard. And the public, for the first time in Marcus's memory, was not willing to accept the Conclave's word as gospel. The protests started small, gatherings outside Conclave offices in major cities, people holding signs that said things like "Love is not anomalous," and "Let him keep his dragon," and Marcus's personal favorite, "The Conclave can't even keep an egg alive but sure take advice from them." They grew quickly. By the end of the first week, there were protests in 47 cities. By the end of the second week, the protests had acquired a name, the Ember Movement, coined by a journalist in London who had written a long-form piece about Marcus and Ember that was equal parts profile and manifesto, and which ended with a sentence that became a rallying cry. Some things are more important than protocols. The government formed a committee. Of course they did. A joint parliamentary panel with representatives from the Environmental Ministry, the Alien Affairs Division, the Military Liaison Office, and in a move that was either inspired or cowardly, depending on your perspective, the Civilian Public Advocacy Office. The committee's mandate was to review the circumstances surrounding the unauthorized possession of a Class A non-sapient species by a private citizen and make recommendations regarding appropriate remedial action. Marcus was summoned to testify. He prepared for 3 days. Not with lawyers, he couldn't afford a lawyer, and the crowdfunding money, while generous, was tied up in a trust that the committee had frozen pending their review, but with data. He compiled everything. Every behavioral log, every veterinary assessment, every temperature reading and feeding record and sleep pattern analysis he had accumulated over 4 months of meticulous documentation. He organized it into a dossier, a physical paper dossier, because he didn't trust digital systems that the Conclave might have access to that was nearly 200 pages long. He cross-referenced his data against every published Conclave paper on dragon development. He highlighted the discrepancies. There were hundreds of them. The hearing was held in a government building in the city center, in a room that was too small for the number of people who wanted to be inside it. Every seat was filled. Every inch of standing room was occupied. Journalists lined the walls, cameras and microphones bristling from every available surface like some kind of mechanical fungus. The air was thick with body heat, and the faint electrical smell of overtaxed recording equipment, and the noise level was a sustained, low roar that the committee chair repeatedly failed to quiet with her gavel. Marcus sat at the witness table and tried to ignore the cameras. He was wearing his good shirt, the blue one, the one without scorch marks, and he had shaved, and he had combed his hair, and he looked, he thought, like a man who was trying very hard to look like he wasn't terrified. Ember was not with him. This was a source of considerable anxiety because Ember did not like being separated from Marcus, and the last time they had been separated briefly, for a veterinary appointment that required Marcus to wait in the reception area, Ember had pushed a bookshelf over and torn a hole in the examination room wall trying to get back to him. But dragons were not allowed in government buildings. This was one of the Conclave's regulations, and the committee had chosen to enforce it, and so Ember was at home, presumably destroying something, and Marcus was sitting in a room full of hostile strangers with nothing but a 200-page dossier and the memory of a dragon pressing its snout against his palm. Director Ames, the committee chair, was a weary-looking woman in her 60s with steel gray hair, and the kind of facial expression that suggested she had been handling difficult people for so long that the concept of difficulty had lost all meaning. She called the hearing to order with a gavel strike that was more symbolic than effective, introduced the panel members with the mechanical cadence of someone reading a grocery list, and then turned her attention to Marcus. "Mr. Chen," she said, "the conclave asserts that your dragon is a danger to public safety and that your so-called bond is a delusion or at best, a temporary conditioning response. How do you respond?" Marcus looked at the Varethi delegation. They were seated in the back row as they always were at these proceedings, a contingent of 5, all in the standard dark uniforms, all with the same expression of controlled disdain that Marcus had come to think of as the Varethi resting face. Toriel was among them, and she was not looking at Marcus. She was looking at the table in front of her tablet dark, her eyes a flat, unreadable gray that might have been calm or might have been fury compressed to the density of a neutron star. He looked at the panel, he looked at the cameras. He looked at the 200 pages in front of him, and then he looked at the audience, the packed room, the standing crowd, the faces of people who had driven hours or flown across the country or tuned in from 100 different countries to watch a 41-year-old wildlife specialist explain to a government committee why he had refused to hand over his dragon to an alien bureaucracy with a perfect record of failure. He opened his mouth. "I respond with a question." Director Ames raised an eyebrow. This was not the expected opening. The conclave's legal team, seated at a separate table to Marcus's left, exchanged glances. One of them, a human, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who had clearly been provided by the conclave as local counsel, leaned forward with the alertness of a predator scenting weakness. "Proceed," Director Ames said. "In the 10 years the conclave has managed dragon conservation on Earth, how many hatchlings have survived to adulthood?" A pause. Director Ames glanced at her notes, shuffled through a few pages, found what she was looking for. 12, out of approximately 200 documented births. A 6% survival rate. Marcus let the number hang in the air for a moment, letting it breathe, letting the audience absorb it. 6%, 12 out of 200, 200 eggs, each one representing a female dragon's investment of months of effort, each one a potential life, and only 12 had made it. Now, how many of those survivors were raised by the conclave directly versus how many were raised in the wild with no conclave involvement? A longer pause. Director Ames flipped through more pages. She consulted with an aide. The aide whispered something. Director Ames's expression shifted by a fraction of a degree, not much, but enough for Marcus to see it because he had spent 4 months learning to read the subtle expressions of a creature whose face was covered in scales. And if he could read Ember, he could certainly read a tired government official. "All 12 were wild raised," she said. "So the conclave's direct intervention has a 0% success rate." Marcus kept his voice level, conversational, as though he were discussing the weather. "They have never successfully raised a dragon hatchling, not once, across 100 worlds as they like to remind us, and yet they consider themselves the foremost experts." The room stirred. A murmur ran through the audience, not loud but present, a living thing that moved through the crowd like wind through grass. The conclave's lawyer started to rise to object, but Director Ames waved him down with a small, tired gesture that suggested she wanted to hear the answer before the objections. "That is a mischaracterization of," Toriel began from the back of the room. Her voice was controlled, precise, each syllable a small act of architectural discipline. "The conclave's management protocols are designed for population-level conservation outcomes, not individual specimen survival. The loss of individual hatchlings is an acknowledged and calculated trade-off in service of broader ecological." "I'm not finished," Marcus said. It was the quiet again. The same quiet from the cemetery, from the apartment hallway, from every moment when Marcus Chen stopped being a careful, methodical man and became something else, something harder, something clearer, something that had been forged in 6 destroyed nests and 4 months of sleepless nights, and the specific, irreplaceable weight of a dragon's head against his palm. Toriel stopped talking. Marcus opened the dossier. "Ember is 4 months old. He is healthy. I have veterinary records from 3 independent practitioners, all of which are included in this dossier, all of which confirm that he is at or above expected developmental benchmarks for his age and subspecies. He is growing at the expected rate. His scales are fully formed, with the correct mineral composition and structural integrity for the Obsidian Mountain variant. His fire capabilities are developing on schedule, both hot and cold variants, which your literature said was impossible for a captive-raised hatchling, because your literature assumes that cold fire development requires maternal thermal cycling during the first 72 hours post-hatching. And since no conclave facility has ever successfully replicated maternal thermal cycling, no conclave-raised hatchling has ever developed cold fire." He turned a page. "Ember has, because I replicated the thermal cycle, not with equipment, not with your protocols. by holding him against my chest for the first 3 days of his life and letting my body heat do what a mother dragon's body heat would have done. It's in the dossier. Temperature logs recorded every 15 minutes for 72 hours. The data is there. Another page. He responds to over 40 distinct vocal cues. I've cataloged them: tone, pitch, duration, context. He differentiates between my voice and other human voices with 100% accuracy. He responds to my emotional state not just to obvious distress, but to subtle changes in breathing pattern, heart rate, and vocal tension that I have not consciously produced. He anticipates my movements. When I stand up from a chair, he moves to position himself between me and the door before I've taken 2 steps. When I reach for my jacket, he goes to the window. These are not trained behaviors. I have never used food rewards or punishment to shape his responses. These are spontaneous, self-directed behaviors that emerged naturally within the context of our relationship. He closed the dossier. The sound was soft, but in the quiet room it landed like a period at the end of a long sentence. He has never injured me. He has never injured anyone who wasn't actively threatening me. He has in fact demonstrated a level of emotional intelligence and protective bonding that your own research papers said dragons were incapable of. Not theoretically unlikely. Incapable, those are your words. From the 2028 Conclave Position Paper on Dragon Cognitive Limits. The species Draco obsidianus montanus is incapable of forming persistent interspecies social bonds. Observed proximity behaviors between dragons and human handlers are attributable to conditioned feeding responses and do not represent genuine attachment. That's what you published. That's what you told every government on this planet. And you were wrong. Marcus looked at Toril, not with anger, not with contempt, with something more devastating than either, with the calm, patient clarity of someone who has been right all along and is finally, after years of being dismissed and ignored and patronized, being given the space to prove it. This is a dossier, he said, holding up the 200 pages. Behavioral logs, veterinary assessments, thermal imaging records, feeding charts, growth curves, vocalization analyses. I've documented everything every single day because I knew you'd come for him eventually. And I knew that your argument would be based on theory, while mine would be based on the actual living creature sleeping on my fire escape. He set the dossier on the table. It landed with a solid, satisfying weight. The Conclave has had 10 years and 200 hatchlings, and they killed every single one through neglect, mismanagement, and an arrogant assumption that they understood dragons better than anyone else. I've had 4 months and 1 hatchling, and he's alive because I did the one thing the Conclave never thought to do. Director Ames leaned forward slightly. The room was utterly silent. Even the cameras seemed to have stopped their electronic murmuring, as though the recording equipment itself was holding its breath. "What's that?" she asked. Marcus looked at Toril. Their eyes met, human and Varethi, brown and gray, across a room full of witnesses and recording devices and the accumulated weight of 4 centuries of Conclave certainty. Toril's eyes were still that flat, unreadable gray, but Marcus saw something in them now that he hadn't seen before. Not defeat, not admission, something smaller and more painful. A crack. A hairline fracture in the wall of certainty that every sentient being builds around the things they believe to be true. The wall that protects them from the terrifying possibility that they might be wrong. "I loved him," Marcus said. The committee's decision was narrow, 5-4 in favor of provisional guardianship. Ember would remain with Marcus under a set of conditions that included quarterly behavioral reviews, monthly veterinary assessments, and the installation of a conclave-approved monitoring system in Marcus's home. A compromise that satisfied no one and offended everyone, which in Marcus's experience was the hallmark of good government. It was not a victory, Marcus knew that. A victory would have been the committee acknowledging that the conclave had no right to dictate the terms of a relationship they had never understood. A victory would have been the revocation of every conclave management protocol on Earth and the establishment of a human-led dragon conservation program based on the actual evidence rather than the conclave's century-old assumptions. A victory would have been Toril standing up and saying, "We were wrong. We were wrong for 400 years, and we are sorry, and we will do better." None of that happened. What happened was a stalemate, a careful, bureaucratic, face-saving stalemate that allowed both sides to claim a measure of success, and allowed the committee to move on to the next item on its agenda without having to confront the full implications of what had been revealed in that hearing room. But it was enough to keep Ember. The Varethi delegation left Earth 2 weeks later. Officially, it was a scheduled rotation, standard personnel turnover, nothing more. Unofficially, every source Marcus had in the government told him the same story. Toril had filed a report. Not a public report, a classified internal review addressed to the Conclave's Biological Oversight Division's Central Command. And the report was, according to one source who had seen a partial draft, the most scathing internal document produced in the division's 400-year history. It detailed in exhaustive forensic detail every failure, every miscalculation, every assumption that had been made about dragon bonding capacity without adequate evidence. It cited Marcus's dossier. It cited the video. It cited the bent containment lance and the frost on the walls and the 43 seconds of footage that had been viewed by 4 billion people across the planet. And it concluded, according to the source, with a single sentence that had caused more consternation within the conclave's upper ranks than any document produced in a generation. We have been wrong about dragons. We have been wrong for 400 years. And if we do not change, we will be wrong for 400 more. Toriel did not speak to Marcus before she left. She did not call, did not write, did not send a message through any of the dozen official and unofficial channels that existed between human institutions and conclave representatives. But on the day her transport launched from the spaceport outside the city, Marcus received a package at his apartment. No return address. No note. Just a small sealed container made of a material he didn't recognize, dark, smooth, warm to the touch, and inside it a data chip. He didn't have a reader for conclave format data chips. He had to take it to a contact at the university, a xenotechnology researcher who owed him a favor and who spent 20 minutes cursing at the compatibility issues before finally managing to extract the files. There was only one file. It was a research paper, unpublished, undated, authored by Toriel alone. The title, translated from the Varethi scientific language, read, "Toward a Reassessment of Interspecies Bonding Capacity in Draco Obsidianus montanus. Observations from an Unauthorized Human-Dragon Pairing." It was 80 pages long. It was meticulous. It was, in its structure and methodology, everything Marcus would have expected from a senior conclave scientist, rigorous, data-driven, carefully argued. But running beneath the scientific language like an underground river was something else. Something that Marcus, after reading the paper 3 times, could only describe as wonder. Toriel had been watching, not just at the checkpoint, not just at the apartment, watching for months, through conclave surveillance systems that Marcus hadn't known about, monitoring systems that had been tracking Ember's thermal signature since the day Marcus had carried the egg out of the Karst Mountains. She had seen everything, the feeding schedules, the sleep patterns, the cold fire development, the way Ember positioned himself between Marcus and every perceived threat. The way the dragon's eyes tracked Marcus's face in a crowd. The way the purring intensified when Marcus was distressed and softened when he was calm, as though Ember's internal thermostat was somehow linked to Marcus's emotional state. Toriel had watched and Toriel had documented and Toriel had written a paper that concluded, with the careful, reluctant precision of a scientist who has been forced by evidence to abandon a lifetime of assumptions, that the bond between Marcus Chen and the dragon-designated specimen K7 was real. Not conditioning, not a feeding response, not a misidentified territorial behavior. Real, genuine, persistent. A social attachment between 2 individuals of different species that met every criterion for bonding that the conclave's own framework established, and that the conclave had spent 4 centuries refusing to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that humans could do something the conclave could not. Marcus held the data chip in his hand for a long time after reading the paper. He sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he had read the conclave's dismissive public statement, the same table where Ember ate breakfast every morning, scattering chicken bits across the floor with joyful enthusiasm, and he thought about Toriel, and about the crack he had seen in her certainty in that hearing room, and about the enormous, terrible, lonely courage it must have taken for a Varethi inspector to write a paper that contradicted everything her species believed about itself. He did not agree with her, not about dragons, not about the conclave, not about the years of arrogance and failure and dead hatchlings that her institution had left in its wake, but he understood her. And understanding, he had learned from Ember, was the first step towards something that might, given enough time and enough patience, become something like respect. They moved out of the city on a Thursday. The property was 50 acres of wooded land in the foothills south of the mountain range, not the karsts themselves, but a lower, gentler range of rounded hills covered in mixed forest with a creek running through the eastern quarter, and most critically, a natural cave system carved into a limestone outcrop at the base of the largest hill. Marcus had found the listing online during the week of the hearing, when he'd been unable to sleep, and had spent the small hours scrolling through real estate listings with a desperation that was part practical planning and part existential coping mechanism. The property was cheap, too cheap, because the cave system made it undesirable for normal residential use, and the nearest town was 40 minutes away on winding roads. It was, in other words, perfect. Ember explored the new territory with an intensity that bordered on religious ecstasy. He had grown rapidly in the weeks since the apartment incident. The stress of the confrontation and the subsequent upheaval seemed to have accelerated his development, as though his body had decided that the world was dangerous and he needed to be bigger and stronger as quickly as possible. He was now nearly 200 pounds, with a wingspan that exceeded Marcus's height and a tail that could knock a chair across a room with a casual flick. His scales had darkened even further if that was possible. The black was so deep now that it seemed to absorb light, leaving only the amber veins visible, glowing softly in the dusk like rivers of molten copper flowing through a landscape of night. The cave became his immediately. He claimed it within an hour of arrival, marking the entrance with scent glands that Marcus couldn't detect but which Ember clearly considered essential, and then disappearing inside for 3 hours before emerging with a coating of cave clay on his snout and an expression of deep satisfaction. Marcus inspected the cave later and found that Ember had rearranged the interior, pushing rocks into piles, scraping smooth depressions in the dirt floor, creating what was unmistakably a nest. His nest, the first one he had ever built for himself. It was smaller than the nest in the Karst Mountains, much smaller. A circle maybe 4 feet across, lined with dried grass that Ember had gathered from the meadow and arranged with a care and precision that belied the image of dragons as clumsy or destructive creatures. It was, Marcus thought, the work of an artist, or a child building a fort, or both. He was both, Ember was both. That was the thing that the Conclave's literature, with its sterile taxonomies and its cold behavioral frameworks, had never captured. Dragons were not simple creatures. They were not driven by instinct alone, any more than humans were driven by biology alone. They were complex, emotional, intelligent beings who built nests and chose bonds and made art out of dried grass and cave clay. And the fact that they did these things without language or thumbs or any of the tools that humans considered essential to complexity did not make the complexity less real. It made it more remarkable. On the night after they moved in, Marcus sat on the porch of the old farmhouse and watched Ember explore the tree line. The farmhouse was rough, a century-old structure with drafty windows, a roof that needed replacing, and a plumbing system that made alarming sounds at irregular intervals. But it was solid, and it was his, and it had a porch that faced west, which meant it caught the sunset every evening in a blaze of gold and amber that turned the whole valley into something out of a painting. Marcus had brought a chair out from the kitchen, a mismatched wooden thing that wobbled slightly on the uneven porch boards, and he sat in it with a cup of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago because he kept forgetting to drink it. Because the view was too good and the air was too clean, and the dragon in the tree line was too fascinating to look away from. Ember moved through the forest like a living shadow. His scales absorbed the fatting light, making him nearly invisible against the dark tree trunks, and only the amber veins gave him away thin lines of copper gold that pulsed softly with each heartbeat, tracing the outline of a creature that was part myth, part reality, and entirely irrevocably his. Every few minutes, Ember would pause in his exploration, lift his head, and look back toward the porch. Not checking that Marcus was still there, he could undoubtedly smell Marcus, hear his heartbeat, sense his thermal signature from hundreds of feet away, but simply looking, acknowledging, maintaining the connection. Then he would bound away again, crashing through the underbrush with the graceless enthusiasm of a teenager who has just been given the run of a theme park. And Marcus would smile and forget his tea, and think about nothing at all except how lucky he was. Ember returned from the tree line as the last light faded from the sky. He came up the porch steps with a measured tread that was markedly different from his exuberant crashing through the forest, slower, more deliberate, as though he was aware that the old farmhouse was less sturdy than the mountain and adjusted his weight accordingly. This was new. This was a level of environmental awareness that the Conclave's developmental benchmarks didn't anticipate for another 6 months at least. Ember was too big to fit in Marcus's lap anymore. This was a source of genuine sadness for Marcus, though he would never have admitted it out loud because there was something irreplaceable about the feeling of a small, warm dragon curled against his chest, the heartbeat against his heart, the purr in his bones. But Ember didn't seem to see his increased size as an obstacle to physical closeness. He simply adapted. He curled around Marcus's chair instead, wrapping his body in a semicircle with his tail coiled around the base and one wing extended over Marcus's legs like a scaled, amber-veined blanket. The wing was enormous, nearly 6 feet from shoulder to tip, and it was warm, radiating a gentle, controlled heat that Marcus had learned to recognize as Ember's comfort setting, the temperature he maintained when he wanted to create a cozy environment rather than defend a position or express an emotion. Ember had learned to modulate his internal temperature to keep Marcus comfortable. No Conclave paper had ever documented this behavior. No Conclave researcher had ever observed it because no Conclave researcher had ever earned it. The behavior required trust, not the passive, default trust of an infant who doesn't know enough to be afraid, but the active, chosen trust of a creature who understood at some level that the being beside him was vulnerable and soft-skinned, and unable to regulate his own body temperature with the precision of a dragon, and who had therefore made a conscious decision to extend his own thermal control to cover his parent as well as himself. Marcus leaned back against Ember's side. The dragon's scales were smooth and warm against his shoulder blades, and through them he could feel the deep rhythm of Ember's breathing, slow, even peaceful. The purr started a moment later, a low rumble that vibrated through the chair and into Marcus's bones, and the sound was so steady, so reliable, so fundamentally there, that it felt less like a noise and more like a law of physics. The purr was the sound the universe made when it was working correctly. The purr was proof that some things, against all odds and all evidence and every reasonable expectation, could still go right. Marcus looked up at the stars. They were extraordinary out here, not the dim, light-polluted scatter of the city, but a full, immersive, overwhelming field of light that turned the sky into a deep bowl of brilliance. The Milky Way was visible as a luminous band across the zenith, and stars were packed so densely in some regions that the spaces between them seemed smaller than the stars themselves. Somewhere out there, among those stars, the Conclave was rewriting its dragon management protocols for the first time in 400 years. Somewhere out there, Toril was telling anyone who would listen that the human was an anomaly, that the bond was a fluke, that it couldn't be replicated. She was wrong. Marcus knew she was wrong, and he suspected that in the private, honest space where Toril kept the things she couldn't say out loud, she knew it too. The bond was not a fluke. It was not an anomaly. It was what happened when a creature capable of profound attachment encountered a being willing to receive that attachment without conditions, without reservations, without the cold, calculating framework of protocols and procedures that reduced living beings to data points and data points to acceptable losses. Ember's purr deepened. His wing tightened slightly over Marcus's legs, a small adjustment barely perceptible, the kind of micro-movement that a less attentive parent might have missed entirely. But Marcus felt it and he understood it, and he reached up and rested his hand on the wing's leading edge, where the membrane was softest and the warmth was strongest. "I've got you, buddy," he said. The words were unnecessary. Ember already knew. Ember had known since the moment he'd cracked through an obsidian shell and pressed his wet, trembling snout against a stranger's thumb in a dark cave in the Karst Mountains. He had known with a certainty that defied language and logic and every scientific framework ever devised by any species on any world. He had known the way a hatchling knows, not with the mind, but with the body, with the heartbeat, with the deep, ancient, pre-verbal knowledge that says this one is mine, and I am theirs, and nothing in the universe will change that. And the baby dragon, 200 pounds of obsidian armor and inverted fire and 4 months of absolute, unwavering devotion, closed his eyes and believed him. Because that was the thing about dragons that the Conclave had spent 400 years failing to understand. They didn't imprint on the strongest. They didn't imprint on the smartest or the most qualified or the most scientifically appropriate. They didn't imprint on the handler with the best equipment or the facility with the best protocols or the institution with the best track record, because track records were paper and protocols were words and equipment was metal, and dragons were none of those things. Dragons were alive. They were alive in the way that only creatures at the absolute apex of their evolutionary development could be alive, fiercely, fully, with every cell and scale and spark of fire tuned to a single, overwhelming purpose: to connect, to bond, to find the one being in the universe that they would hold above all others and say, without words, without conditions, without end, you are mine and I am yours. And they didn't choose based on credentials. They didn't choose based on species. They didn't choose based on anything that could be measured or quantified or entered into a conclave database. They chose based on something simpler, something older, something that existed before science and would exist after it, because it was not a product of evolution or biology or environmental conditioning but a fundamental property of the universe itself. As basic as gravity, as constant as light, as irrefutable as the heartbeat of a sleeping dragon pressed against the chest of the person it had chosen. They chose the one who stayed. Marcus Chen had stayed, in a collapsed nest in the Karst Mountains with an egg against his heart and the cold closing in. In a cramped apartment with scorch marks on the walls and frost on the windows and a creature that the most powerful scientific institution in the known galaxy said could not love him. In a hearing room full of cameras and hostility and the weight of 4 centuries of wrongness. In a farmhouse on 50 acres of woodland, with a dragon curled around his chair and the stars wheeling overhead and the whole absurd, improbable, magnificent adventure of it stretching out before him like an unexplored valley. He had stayed, and the dragon had chosen him. And in the end, after the protocols and the procedures and the laminated cards and the containment lances and the 100 worlds and the 400 years and the 200 dead hatchlings whose names nobody remembered, in the end, that was all it had ever taken. Not expertise, not authority, not technology. Just stay. Just love. Just be there when the shell cracks and something small and wet and impossibly alive looks up at you with amber eyes and says, in the only language it knows, you are mine. Ember slept. Marcus watched the stars. The purr filled the night like a heartbeat, steady and warm and eternal, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the tree line, an owl called and a creek murmured, and the world went on being the kind of place where impossible things happened every day if you were brave enough to let them. He was brave enough. They both were.